Montana Territory, 1879. The first time Fletcher Thorne laid eyes on her, she was carrying a tray of whiskey glasses through the back room of the Ruby Lantern. Her eyes flat like still water, her mouth set in a line that had forgotten how to smile. Her name was Rosalind Tabor, and she moved like someone who had learned the hard way not to flinch. Fletcher had not planned to stay in Billings more than a night, but something about the way she kept her head low and her shoulders squared made him pause at the threshold. He had seen women like her before, stuck in a place they never chose, worn down by men who thought a coin could buy silence or kindness. He sat down at a corner table. Rosalind came by with a bottle and a glass. "You eating or just drinking?" she asked, voice even. "Drinking, for now." She gave a small nod and turned, but he said, "Wait." She looked back, her eyes cautious. "You always work nights?" Her jaw clenched. "Always." Fletcher nodded. "That seems like a waste." She blinked, almost confused. "A waste?" He shrugged, poured his whiskey, and said nothing more. The next 2 nights he stayed. Every time she brought his drinks. Every time he asked her one new question: where she was from, how long she had been there, what brought her to Billings. She never gave him full answers, but she never walked away angry either. On the 4th night, a man grabbed her wrist as she passed his table. Fletcher was on his feet in a breath. She tried to yank free, but the man only laughed. "Come on, Rosie. You've been cold all week." Fletcher stepped between them. "Let go of her." The man stood. "She's not yours." Fletcher pulled back his coat just enough to show the revolver at his hip. "Not yet." The man let go, muttered something, and stumbled toward the saloon doors. Rosalind stared at Fletcher. "You should not have done that. He should not have touched you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away. That night, Fletcher did not sleep. The next morning, he found the saloon owner, a man named Deke, and slapped down a wad of cash on the bar. "What's this?" Deke asked. "I want her contract." Deke snorted. "She is not for sale, Cowboy." Fletcher's eyes didn't waver. "I am not buying her. I am buying her freedom." Deke stared at the money. "That's 5 years' worth easy. Then she is free 5 times over." Deke licked his lips. "You sweet on her?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. "I want her out of here. That is all." An hour later, Rosalind was standing outside the Ruby Lantern for the first time in 2 years without a shift to work. "You bought me," she said, arms crossed. "I paid off your contract," Fletcher said. "That place owned you. Now it doesn't." Her voice was wary. "And what now? You want me to follow you like a stray?" He shook his head. "No. I want you to choose." She blinked. He stepped closer but kept his hands at his sides. "You do not owe me anything. But I will ask you one thing: what kind of life do you want?" She stared at him. For the first time in days, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but something that reached for it. "I do not know," she whispered. "Then come with me, until you do." She looked down at her boots, then back at the saloon. "I was 15 when my mother died. A man promised me work in Helena. He brought me here instead. I will see to it you never end up like that again," Fletcher said softly. "But only if you want my help." She nodded. "Just once." They left Billings by horseback that same afternoon, heading west. For 3 days they rode through pine-covered hills and open valleys. Rosalind did not speak much, but Fletcher did not press her. He showed her how to cook beans over a fire, how to listen for wolves on the wind. On the 4th night, she asked, "Why did you do it?" He looked at her across the flames. "Because no one else did." She stared into the fire. "You do not even know me." "I want to." That night, she did not sleep far from him. They reached the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains by the end of the week. Fletcher had a cabin there, an old trapper's place he had bought the year before. It was small but solid. He showed her the garden bed, the chickens, the creek that ran nearby. "It is not much," he said, "but it is quiet." She smiled. It was small, but it was real. He watched her settle into the porch step, her eyes soft for the first time since he met her. "You still want to know what kind of life I want?" she asked. He nodded. She looked around at the trees, the sunlight on the grass. "I think maybe this." He sat beside her. "Then I will build a better fence and fix the roof." She laughed quick, surprised. It was the first sound of joy he had heard from her, and it cracked something wide open in him. "Rosalind," he said, his voice low, "you do not owe me anything, but I would be proud to build a life with you, if you ever wanted that." She looked at him, her eyes full now, not flat, not empty. "Ask me again," she said, "when I have something to give back." "I will," he promised. And he meant it. The first frost came early that year. A thin crust of ice lined the bucket by the well, catching morning light like glass. Rosalind stood beside it, sleeves rolled past her elbows, the pump handle cold in her hand. Her breath came out in short clouds. She didn't mind the cold, it felt clean. Fletcher was splitting kindling by the shed. Sleeves rolled too, though his coat hung open. He worked in steady rhythm, each crack of the axe clean and final. She watched him a moment longer than she meant to. He noticed. "You planning to haul that water, or just freeze beside it?" She picked up the bucket. "I'm still learning what's expected of me." "No expectations here," he said, stacking the wood. "Just what needs doing." Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and smoke. She set the water by the hearth and crouched to feed the fire. The logs caught quick. Fletcher came in behind her and shed his gloves, rubbing his hands by the heat. "I was thinking," he said, not looking at her. "We might ride down to the valley tomorrow. There's a woman near Darby who keeps bees. Trades honey for eggs or sewing." Rosalind brushed ash off her skirt and stood. "What would you trade?" He looked up at her. "I was hoping you might decide that." She tilted her head. "Why? Seemed to me you might like to choose your own trade." She didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "I can sew." "I figured, but I'd rather learn the bees." He nodded. "Then we'll ride out after breakfast." That night, she stood by the window while he read at the table. The sky outside had turned clear, stars sharp above the pines. She folded her hands together, her fingers restless. "You ever married?" she asked suddenly. Fletcher didn't lift his eyes from the page. "No, why not? Didn't meet anyone I'd trust to stay." He closed the book. "You?" She shook her head. "No," he waited. "I've been owned," she said finally, "but not married." He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort or soften the air with platitudes. Just let the truth sit where she'd placed it. She turned from the window. "You ever think about settling in a town? Somewhere with neighbors? A church maybe? I tried once, in Miles City. Didn't take." "Why not?" "Too many folks asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." She nodded like she understood. "People like things tidy. Stories with straight edges." "I'm not tidy," he said, "and I don't trust straight edges." She gave a small sound, almost a laugh, and sat across from him. Her hands were still folded, the knuckles pale. "Do you think I could learn to keep bees?" she asked. "I know you could. I'm not asking what you know. I'm asking what you believe." He looked at her without blinking. "I believe you could do anything you decide to." Her throat moved. She looked down. The next morning, they rode out before the sun had fully risen. The trail was narrow and wound through fir and tamarack. Rosalind rode a bay mare steady, sure-footed, and Fletcher kept pace beside her. Their breath steamed in the cold. Your mother, he said as they reached a clearing. What was she like? Rosalind didn't answer right away. Then, she sang while she worked, always half under her breath. Sometimes hymns, sometimes old ballads she learned from her mother. Do you sing? I used to. He waited. She died in spring. There were lilacs blooming behind the house. I remember that more than the funeral. Fletcher didn't try to fill the silence that followed. He let it settle between them, like snow that didn't need sweeping. The woman with the bees lived in a narrow valley flanked by cottonwoods. Her name was Mrs. Lyle, and she had the kind of face that had seen more than it said. She wore a shawl and a wide-brimmed hat and motioned them toward the hives without much talk. Rosalind watched the bees move in and out of the boxes. Are they always this calm? Mrs. Lyle lifted a frame. They're like people. If you treat them with respect, they usually won't sting. Rosalind stepped closer. What happens if you make a mistake? They teach you not to do it again. By the time they rode back, the sun had dipped low and the mountains burned orange. Fletcher glanced sideways at her. You still want to learn them? Rosalind nodded. They make their own order. I like that. He gave a quiet grunt and shifted in the saddle. I got a spare veil and gloves in the shed. You can start next week if you want. She looked at him, the corner of her mouth catching slightly. I want. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the kind that didn't press down. The kind that held room for breath, for thought, for the long shape of trust finding its place. That night, she stood on the porch while he banked the fire inside. The stars were out again, same as before, but they didn't feel so distant now. When he stepped out to stand beside her, she didn't move away. Thank you, she said quietly. He looked at her. For what? For not asking me to be grateful sooner. He reached for her hand, slow and certain, and when she didn't pull away, he wrapped his fingers around hers. You don't owe me thanks, he said. She tilted her face toward his. I'm not giving it because I owe it. He nodded, and when she stepped closer, he didn't speak. Just let the moment be what it was, something new, something neither of them had been given before. The frost held through the next morning, but something warmer had taken root. Neither of them said it aloud. But it was there, steady as the mountain behind them, waiting to grow. The bees arrived in crates wrapped in burlap, their hum muffled but constant. Rosalind stood back as Fletcher lifted each box from the wagon bed, his shoulders straining under the weight. The sun was high, but the air carried the scent of snow from the ridges. She waited until he set down the last crate beside the orchard slope, then stepped forward. I thought they'd be smaller, she said, kneeling to inspect the mesh-covered openings. They're only loud when they're crowded, he said. Same as people. She kept her fingertips tucked into her palms. I'd like to start with the feeding boards. And the smoker, I want to see how it's packed. He handed her the tin canister without a word and watched as she opened it, examined the curled bark inside. Fletcher had never seen someone learn so deliberately. She didn't hurry. She didn't ask questions she could answer herself. She studied each movement he made, and when he offered the veil, she tied it under her chin with steady hands. They spent the next hour placing the hives in the sunniest corner of the slope, just shy of the cottonwoods. Rosalind moved in silence, her boots sinking into soft earth. She didn't flinch when the bees began to circle. Fletcher stayed a few steps behind, letting her lead where she could. Later, as they walked back toward the cabin, she said, I want to build the stands higher, maybe with flat stones underneath. I don't like how damp that ground is. He glanced at her. All right, I'll need a handsaw. It's in the shed bottom shelf. She didn't smile, but her mouth eased. I know. After supper, she didn't go to the porch as usual. Instead, she stayed inside, scraping honeycomb from the borrowed frame Mrs. Lyle had given her. Her sleeves were rolled again, this time speckled with wax. Fletcher sat at the table, mending the leather strap of his saddlebag. "You ever think about planting fruit trees?" she asked, not looking up. "Thought about it last year. Never got around to it." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "There's a man down past the river who trades science. I could write to him, see what he's got." He threaded the awl through the leather. "All right. I'd want to graft early. Spring's not far. I'll help dig." She paused. "Would that be all right?" Adding to the place, Fletcher set the strap down. "It's yours too. Whatever you plant, I'll make sure it keeps." She stood still then, one hand on the table, the other holding the cloth. "I never got to plant anything before. Not for myself." He nodded once. "Then it's about time." That night, she left the window open a crack. The cold crept in, but so did the sound of wind moving through pine. Fletcher didn't mention it, just added more wood to the fire and left his coat slung over the chair nearest her bed. Come morning, she found a pair of gloves mended on the table. Her own, the stitching neater than before, the seams tight. She slipped them on before going out. The hives were quiet in the early light, dew clinging to the lids. She crouched beside one, running her gloved hand along the side. Fletcher watched from the fence, arms resting on the top rail. "I was thinking," she said without turning, "I could build a frame press, one that saves the wax easier." His voice was low. "You think you'll stay long enough to use it?" She stood. "I'm not planning to leave." He didn't move. "Not planning is different than choosing." She faced him fully. "I choose this." A crow called from the woods behind them. She stepped around the hive and walked to the fence. When she stopped in front of him, her breath rose between them in faint clouds. "You asked me what kind of life I wanted." Her voice was steady. "I want one where I wake up and know what work waits for me, where the things I build stay where I leave them. I want to tend something that grows. And I want someone beside me who sees me as I am, not what I was." He didn't speak right away. Then he said, "I want to be that man." She reached out, not fast, but sure, and touched the collar of his coat. "Then stay close." "I will." And he did. That evening they dug the first hole for the apple trees. The soil was dark and damp, rich enough to hold roots. Fletcher swung the pick while Rosalind shoveled, both of them working until their shoulders ached. When they finished, she leaned on the handle, breathless. "I don't know if they'll take," she said. He brushed dirt from his hands and looked at her. "Doesn't matter. You planted them." She stared at the hole, then at him. "I want to marry you." Fletcher's brow creased, not in surprise but in the weight of the moment. "I want that too, but not just for the sake of it." "Not for the sake of it," she said. "For the building of it." He nodded once. "Then I'll ride to Derby tomorrow. Bring Reverend Kane back before week's end." She stood straighter, her shoulders set. "I'll bake bread and clean the floor." He reached for her hand, laced his fingers with hers. "We'll start with that." And together they did. 3 days after the trees were planted, Reverend Kane rode up the path with a dust-caked Bible and a coat patched at the elbows. Fletcher stepped off the porch to meet him, nodding once. Rosalind had already cleared the table and swept the hearth, her hands steady even as her heart pressed against her ribs like it meant to split them. The Reverend shook the dust from his sleeves but didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You'll want it simple, I reckon." Fletcher glanced toward the open cabin door. She said plain words, no sermon. "Done." Inside, Rosalind smoothed her hair behind her ears, the worst of its uneven cut now grown past her collar. She wore the same gray dress she'd arrived in, though she'd stitched fresh hems along the sleeves by hand. Fletcher hadn't seen her touch it in weeks, but she'd brought it out that morning and hung it in the cold air until the creases fell loose. When he stepped inside, she looked up. "You sure?" He didn't hesitate. "You?" She nodded, and he offered his arm. They stood by the hearth, the fire low but steady, while the Reverend read the words in a voice worn by wind and dust. Rosalind's hands didn't shake, and Fletcher's grip was firm, his thumb brushing her knuckle once when she slipped the ring onto his finger. It wasn't gold. It wasn't anything more than a carved band of polished pine he'd made behind the shed the morning before. But she turned it twice on his hand, then looked up and smiled, not wide, but certain. After the Reverend left, the sun dipped behind the ridge. They didn't speak of the vows again. They didn't need to. He brought in more wood. She stirred the stew. Their lives simply folded into one another like logs laid in a fire, each catching the other's warmth. That night, she set a quilt at the foot of his bed. Then she stepped back, her fingers curled at her sides. "I want to share the bed," she said, "because I choose it, not because I owe you anything." He rose from the chair slowly, not touching her. "Then come to me when you're ready. I'll be here." She crossed to him, lifted her hand to his chest, and rested it there. "I'm ready." In the dark, they didn't rush. They moved like people who'd both been hurt and learned not to take softness for granted. His hands never pressed. Hers never flinched. They held each other long after the fire burned low, and when sleep pulled her under, she was curled into his side, her breath warm at his neck. The next morning, she rose early and took the axe from its peg. Fletcher found her behind the shed, splitting cedar for kindling, her stance sure. He didn't interrupt, just leaned against the doorframe and watched. When she noticed him, she set the axe aside. "There's something I want to build." "What kind of something?" She wiped her brow with her sleeve. "A box for the comb scraps. I think I can melt them down cleaner if they're kept dry." He nodded. "I'll help shape the boards. I want to do the joints myself. I've been watching how you set them." He grinned. "Then I'll keep out of your way." By mid-afternoon, she'd laid out the lengths of pine and begun sawing with smooth, even strokes. Fletcher sat nearby repairing a harness strap, keeping quiet while the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods. A hawk passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the grass. Rosalind paused, watching it until it vanished. "My mother used to say hawks carried messages," she murmured. "What kind of messages?" "Ones you had to be quiet to understand." He didn't ask more. She liked him best when he didn't fill the air with questions. That evening, she set the finished box beneath the shelf beside the hearth. Fit snug, the lid flush. She stepped back, arms crossed. "You think it'll hold?" He ran a hand along the edge. "It's solid, like the woman who built it." She looked up at him. "I'm not sure I know how to live quiet yet, without looking over my shoulder." "You don't have to be sure," he said. "Just keep living and it'll come." That night, she reached for him without hesitation. Later, when they lay tangled in silence, she said, "I still hear his voice sometimes. The one who brought me to Billings." He held her tighter. "He can't reach you here. I know, but it's like a ghost that forgets it's dead." Fletcher didn't speak. He just breathed beside her, steady and deep, until her body followed his rhythm and her thoughts quieted. By the following week, the trees had taken root. When she pressed her palm to the soil around them, she felt the faintest give of new growth beneath the surface. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned toward the cabin. From the threshold, Fletcher called, "You hungry?" She smiled. "Always." And she was. For food, for work, for the long stretch of quiet days ahead. For the man waiting beside the fire, whose steadiness had never once asked her to be anything but whole. Fletcher leaned his weight into the post-hole digger, Boots sunk deep in thawed spring soil, while Rosalind knelt nearby fitting wire to the first stretch of fence. The orchard had taken well tiny green buds had pushed from the branches last week, and the bees moved thick through the air, drunk on the scent of early plum blossoms. A meadowlark called from a pine stump, and Rosalind paused, squinting toward the ridge. There's something grazing up there. Fletcher followed her line of sight. Mule deer. Been coming down since the thaw. Think they'll bother the trees? Not if we get the fence up this week. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I'll finish tying this stretch if you want to dig the next. He handed her the spool of wire without a word, already turning toward the next post. They fell into rhythm, her hands sure with knots, his steady with the digger. By noon, the sun had warmed the grass enough for them to eat outside. Fletcher passed her a strip of dried venison and a heel of bread. They sat on the half-finished fence, boots in the grass, backs to the orchard. She chewed in thoughtful silence, then said, I've been thinking about writing my brother. Fletcher wiped his hand on his trousers. You ever hear from him? Not since I left Missouri. He was younger. We fought more than we talked. You think he's still there? I don't know. But if he is, I'd like him to know I'm alive. He nodded. You want help with the letter? She shook her head. I want to do it myself. Just not today. They finished their meal in silence, and by mid-afternoon the fence had reached the edge of the bee yard. Fletcher stood back, examining the line. We'll need a gate. I can build one. He raised an eyebrow. You ever built a gate? No, but I've built everything else I needed. That night, after the sun dropped behind the trees, Rosalind sat by the table with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. She stared at the blank sheet a long time before writing the first line. Fletcher didn't interrupt. He ran his whetstone along the edge of his hunting knife, the sound soft and steady. When she finished, she folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. I'll write it down to the post in Darby next time I go, he said. She looked up. Would you? He nodded. Course. She reached across the table, laid her hand over his, and left it there. The next morning, a wagon pulled up the trail. Fletcher's neighbor, Emery Bell, with a crate of seed potatoes balanced on the seat beside him. Rosalind stepped out to greet him, brushing her hands on her apron. Morning, Mrs. Thorne, Emery said. Got those starts you asked about. She helped him lower the crate. Appreciate it. Gotta say, place is looking fine. Heard from Lyle you've got bees now. Rosalind nodded. For hives and a press. Emery whistled. You planning to sell? Maybe next year. This one's for keeping. Fletcher came around the cabin just as Emery was climbing back onto the wagon. Tell your wife that salve she sent worked, he said. I'll do that. You two take care now. Spring's moving fast. They watched the wagon roll down the trail, dust rising behind it. Rosalind turned to Fletcher. He called me Mrs. Thorne. You are. She let the words settle. Still getting used to it. He smiled, real and quiet. Me too. That afternoon, they planted the potatoes in neat rows behind the cabin. Fletcher dug, and Rosalind laid in the seed, covering each hill with care. When they finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. I never thought I'd be happy with dirty hands, she said. He offered her his canteen. Happiness doesn't mind dirt. She drank, then passed it back. You ever think about children? He looked at her, surprised but not unsettled. I've thought about what kind of man I'd need to be, if it ever happened. She rested her chin on her knees. I'm not asking for now. I know, but I think we'd be good at it. You've got patience and I've got a steady aim. She laughed, and it lingered in the warm air between them. We'll see what the land gives us first. Weeks passed. The orchard bloomed. The hives grew heavy, and the bees swarmed once. Rosalind caught them herself, guiding them into a new box with smoke and calm words. Fletcher watched from a distance, arms crossed, pride plain on his face. By summer, the first jars of honey lined their shelf. Fletcher built a small press table, and Rosalind stitched muslin bags to strain the wax. They worked side by side, the rhythm of the days shaped by sun and soil. One evening, after a long day hoeing weeds from between the rows, Rosalind stood in the doorway, watching the sky turn gold. Fletcher came up behind her, resting his hand on the small of her back. "You ever miss the town?" he asked. "No," she said. "I miss some voices, but not the place." He nodded. "You think your brother'll write back?" "I hope so, but if he doesn't, I've still got everything I need." He turned her toward him, hands light on her waist. "You sure?" She leaned into him. "I've never been more certain." He kissed her then, slow and full, like a promise already kept. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I want to grow old here," she whispered. "We will." Years passed like that, quiet and full. The orchard bore fruit by the third season, and the honey sold well enough to buy a plow mule. Fletcher added a second room to the cabin, and Rosalind taught herself to read ledgers so she could keep their accounts. Letters came from Missouri, eventually a nephew born, a sister-in-law kind. They wrote back with news of bees and frost and the taste of plum preserves. When gray touched Fletcher's temples and fine lines spread at the corners of Rosalind's eyes, neither of them mourned the years. They had lived each one full. One fall morning, she stood at the edge of the orchard, the trees heavy with apples, and watched as Fletcher carried a basket toward her. He stopped beside her, set it down, and took her hand. "Frost'll come soon," he said. She smiled. "We're ready." He kissed her palm, then laced their fingers together. Always were, and they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, the bees humming behind them, the earth rich beneath their feet, and nothing left unresolved between them.